In this video, as well as talking about how to analyze a photo, I'm going to then draw that photo and see if it can capture something of what I was hoping to capture through my analysis of the photo. This is the photo I chose, a sparkling Sydney summer's day. The important question to ask is, what is it that I particularly like about this scene that I want to draw? Why have I chosen it? We need to go beyond wanting our drawings simply to be an accurate copy of what we're drawing. We want our drawings to capture some quality in our reference. And being aware of this will give us a focus when we draw for our attention, our time, and our line work. So what did I like about this scene? I liked the light. I liked the sense of sparkle. I liked this overhanging branch of an old jacaranda tree covered in summer purple blooms that create a carpet on the ground. A lot of Australians think that the jacaranda is actually a tree that comes from Australia because there are so many of them in our cities, but it's actually a magnificent South American tree. What did I like about this scene? Well, I liked this zigzag effect down here on the left side of our pathway. I like the two men walking along. They create a sense of journey, of story, which I think is always interesting in a scene. I like the way there were different levels horizontally. So we've got this closer retaining wall. We've got these zigzag retaining walls further back. We've got another one in the distance. We've got the men and this building here. We've got buildings behind that, and we've got a few buildings right in the distance. And then as we go higher again, we bounce back to the closest objects, which are these overhanging jacaranda branches. And there's also interest, I think, vertically as well. We've got these strong vertical poles. We go from grass to pathway to grass again. And then another thing to consider at this point is, what do I not like about the scene? Either because I don't like it in terms of the composition, or I don't like it because I'm not confident that I'm going to be able to draw it effectively. There are some subjects that it simply makes sense to wait until our drawing level has advanced a bit before we attempt them. What don't I like about this? What I don't like is this very large expanse of pathway here. Now, there is actually shadow on it, but I'm just not sure if it doesn't create too much of an empty space in the foreground. I also don't like this electricity box here, so I think I'm going to leave that out. All of this foliage is going to be a challenge. Trying to create separation between these blossoms, between the leaves behind, and the effect of sunlight and shade and shadow on the trees in the foreground, the midground, and these ones much further back in the distance. So the question that comes from this is, do I want to crop my scene at all? To either improve the composition, if I can leave out some objects or some areas that I think are a bit weaker, or maybe simply to remove or lessen the parts that I think might be a bit tricky or time consuming to draw. And yes, I've decided I will crop this, and this is how I cropped it. So I basically took out the foreground to this point, and then I took out the side to this point. So I've taken quite a lot off it. It's also, let me zoom in on what I think are the most interesting parts. This dynamic zigzag shape here. I've kept the sense, in fact, I've probably increased the sense of being a winding road that these men are journeying on, because on the side I've cropped out, it actually was not so winding. It has the effect of bringing these mid-ground distant buildings closer, which I think works nicely. Are there any losses in the crop that I'm sad about? Yes, I'm sad to lose this tree because it's a nice distinctive tree, which is a very clearly defined but different form to the other trees in the scene. But I think overall, I'm happier to crop to this size, to leave out this electricity box, which is even more prominent now, and do my best with the blossoms, which maybe will be a little bit easier being closer. This is our drawing. And the question is now, what materials do I want to use to draw it with? Obviously, I'm going to use a fine liner pen, but as well as that, how am I going to work all of these shades? Do I want to use hatching or do I want to use tone? And I think I'm going to use marker tone because there's an awful lot to do, and besides the time factor, I actually think I can do a more effective job of trying to create the sense of light if I use marker tone rather than line. For my line, I'm going to use a 0.3mm multi-liner for most of it, but a 0.2 for some of these finer lines on the jacaranda tree. In terms of my pens, I'm going to use Copic sketch markers, the brush end. And I've got on hand N0 to N5 to draw these. I don't think I want to go any darker than that. N6 starts to look pretty black, which I don't really want in this drawing. I still want my line work, I think, to be the darkest element in the drawing. So I'll set up some paper, and if you want to keep watching, I'll draw this on camera and we'll see how the elements that we've thought about and the decisions that we've made with the composition, how they work in practice, and if we're happy with them at the end. And if you've made it to this point, why not subscribe to my channel if you haven't already? I've got well over 250 videos at this point, and whatever subject you like to draw, many of them are bound to be helpful. So let's have a look. In real time, this drawing took me an hour and a quarter to do. I start with this bottom left corner. I find it's often helpful starting in the foreground, and because I'm right-handed, if there's no compelling reason to start somewhere else, then moving from left to right always ends up feeling more natural. So there's this interesting stone wall here, but I decide to do some of the more mid-ground subjects first, and just to create a sense of scale before I move in with these walls. You can see me measuring the angles with my pen as I do for perspective angles with buildings. Trying to get this zigzag correct was a fair focus. It certainly was, I thought, one of the most dramatic visual elements of the scene, and one of the important reasons why I wanted to draw it. So I did want to try and capture the tightness of the zigzag and not to let them become too open, not to widen the angles too much. If I did that, it would also cause problems with then where the mid-ground would be situated. I wanted to keep this nice and tight across the center of the drawing. So I start to position some of this building in the background, and I realize I've gone too far across. My drawing is going to be wider than my reference, but I decide that that's not a huge problem. I put the figures in a tiny bit too large, I realize, but again, can't do much about that. And it just, I think, has the effect of making them look a little bit closer to us in my drawing than they were in real life. With these buildings in the background, I think it is fairly important to be pretty gestural with them. It really is the tree and this retaining wall in the front that are the closest elements. The architecture is all in the distance, so need to have a lighter touch with those. And I'm not going to put too much line work there. So trying to redefine things and work out what I'm doing, I do some suggestion of brickwork. I don't think this is probably going to particularly show up through the tone I'm going to put on, but I decided to add just a little bit. Well, now I reach the point where I really do need to start to put these branches in. I put the main sections in. Look how I draw them. I don't actually start at one end and draw them in a long snake to the other end. I draw them in sections, particularly branches such as these that bend all over the place in all different directions, which creates some quite extreme angles. It's better to actually draw them in sections, I think. And I do my hatching across so that at least in some parts I can capture the effect of roundedness. I mean, I didn't want this to be a long drawing. It was still meant to be fairly quick and gestural, so I didn't get too bogged down with the hatching. But I did want to suggest roundedness in parts of it at least. And now I start doing some of these branches. So I'm getting to the trickier part, which is how to represent the jacaranda blossoms. I've got this vague sense in my head of how I'm going to do that, but I start with these darker areas, trying to work out what's the best way to go. I've decided to use tone, to use N0 for the roadway or for most of it, and that the only parts I'm actually going to leave white are the top of the retaining walls and that strip of grass behind the fence. That most of the rest of this, the lightest tones, are going to be N0 or N1. Having been trying to draw the tree branches and foliage with line, it is a nice feeling to get the ink markers to work. But I'm still not 100% sure exactly how I'm going to try and capture the effect. And that's the question I've got to keep asking myself. What effect do I want, and how can I capture that effect? Rather than trying to, if you like, draw all the blossoms, I need to capture the effect of the blossoms. So it is a fairly spotty, dotty affair. So I'm realizing that I'm going to have to create that, which means lots of marks on and off the paper. So I try and develop a fairly quick way of doing that. Every now and then it's important to step back and ask, is it working? I want to go fairly dark across the middle because these blossoms are meant to be quite light. I spend a fair bit of time on this retaining wall, but that's okay because it's in the foreground and it's a nice visual contrast, the effect of the shadow on the stonework to all the foliage and the jacaranda blossoms. Now there are some very dark trees behind the jacaranda, and I want to capture their leaves in a way because they throw the actual blossoms into relief by being a dark background to them. One of the things I often like to do in this situation is I actually define the forms with the tone, and then I come back to add some pen work now that I know exactly where the darker tones are. I'm working on a few details now, as you can see, looking to see where my line work can be added. And so finishing this and that, lots of dots and dabs and jabs, and I have picked up my 0.2mm pen just to do a bit more of the effect of the branches. And that's pretty much it. What do I think? Well, I really do wish I had left the purple blossom on the mid left hand side a bit lighter. That's probably you can see now that the drawings come back down, but otherwise I'm happy with it. If I did this again, I could certainly do a better job, which is always a good feeling to have when we leave a painting. G'day, Stephen Travers. Hope you found this helpful and interesting. I'll put this on my community page. If you want to have a go drawing the photo yourself, then feel free. But whatever you draw, have fun. See you next time. Bye.